Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Janine Mason. I'm the Executive Director and founder of the Fieldstone Leadership Network San Diego, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our FORTIFY webinar today on personal and professional resilience. FORTIFY is a partnership between the University of San Diego's Nonprofit Institute and Fieldstone, and for two organizations who aim to work to support nonprofit leaders. The COVID-19 pandemic has given us an opportunity to come together to do work that we value and that we love in partnership. And so FORTIFY is aimed at being able to build the personal and professional leadership and well-being and sustainability of not only our nonprofit leaders, but also their organizations. And so each week we offer two webinars. On Tuesday, we offer a webinar that's focused on the professional organizational leadership required to navigate through COVID-19. And on Fridays, we offer a wellness session, which is aimed to help nonprofit leaders to navigate personally through the challenges that leadership requires during trauma and a pandemic. And so we are really pleased to be able to have this session today on resiliency. To help make the most of this experience today, I wanted to let you know if you're having any technical difficulties whatsoever, please feel free to contact Cynthia Fernandez. You'll see her email on your screen. You can also contact Cynthia using the chat box and she'll do whatever she can to help you. Just for your information, I want to let you know that everyone is muted on the webinar today. If you have questions, please feel free to add those to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will be monitoring those throughout the webinar. And we're going to be saving questions today for Dr. Green at the end of the presentation. So we will be monitoring those questions. Don't feel nervous if we haven't asked it yet. We will do that at the end. And resources that you have that you'd like to contribute to our community today, we'll ask you to put those in the chat box and we'll collect those and disseminate them after the webinar today. We will have our after hours, which is an extended time of 10 minutes for questions so that we can make sure that we get to all of your questions today. We are recording this webinar, and that recording and the resources that we have will be added to both the Fieldstone website and to the Nonprofit Institute's website. You see those addresses on your screen as well. And I know that many of you are new to either USD and the Nonprofit Institute or Fieldstone, and we'd like to welcome you. And if you're interested in our programs, please visit our websites because we would love to welcome you into our leadership development community. Again, I want to just remind you that the speaker will be available for 10 minutes after the webinar so that we can take all of your additional questions and make sure that you get all the support that you need. We are working, as I said, in partnership, and Laura Dietrich, who's not able to be here with us today, has played a key role in developing FORTIFY, along with Lynn Corbett. And Lynn is the Director of Governance and Community Programs at the Nonprofit Institute. He's also a doctoral candidate. I've had the great pleasure of working with Lynn on a board that I sit on, and he has been a consultant to us, and he's a very wise young man. And so it's been a pleasure to work with him on this effort, and it's a pleasure now to introduce him to you all.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Janine. You know, we have been doing this for a while, and just for the past few weeks, and I think that the partnership that we started here really strengthened through each time we do these webinars. So I thank Janine and the Fieldstone Network for this, for working together with us. So for many of you who have seen it, what we've done is we've been trying to survey the community to see where their biggest concerns are. And one, the assistance that people said that they need capacity support with. We're reevaluating some of their fundraising strategies, guidance for our board of directors. And on Tuesday, we hosted a governance program. And then when we, my son has a loose tooth. So what happened is that 72% of real time are about keeping government entities up to speed. So what happens is that a lot of times what we've been asking for people to, people have been letting us know that it's not only about letting them know now what's going on, but how can we continue to update them and provide real-time data. So we've been doing that, but we've also used this data to design this program. So today what you'll see is you'll see some information in regards to personal resilience. And if we'll go to the next slide and I'll introduce Dr. Green to you so we can get started. So Dr. Zachary Green is a professor of practice here at the University of San Diego in the Leadership Studies. He's also the Director of Leadership Initiatives at the Nonprofit Institute. And for many of you know, he has been the lead faculty for the Rise Urban Leadership Program, a clinical psychologist by training. He teaches courses on human development, organizational behavior, coaching, and negotiations, mindfulness, and love. His clients have included multinational corporations, government agencies, NGOs, universities, religious institutions, and nonprofit entities. He has coached top leaders at the World Bank for the better part of 2 decades. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Zachary Green.
Hello, everyone. And thank you for being at this webinar on resilience. And so what we're going to do is we're simply going to pull up the slides so that you have an idea of what we're going to be working on. Personal and professional resilience in a time of pandemic is really quite a challenge. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do an exploration of some of the ways of thinking about resilience. Then we're also going to do a couple practical exercises to get you ready. And then at the end of this hour, we hope that you have 1 or 2 directions that you can go with your own resilience. So let's go to that next slide and let's begin to see what we're talking about here. So I would imagine a lot of you know about Viktor Frankl. He was a survivor of the Holocaust, and what he looked at was what were the factors that allowed people to survive the horror of that trauma. And what he said was this: when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. So this workshop is going to be an invitation to look at ways that we can begin to challenge ourselves to change in the face of something that we are not yet able to change ourselves. Next slide, please. So when we talk about resilience, we also have to think about it in the context of trauma. And what do we mean by that? There's been a recent spate of articles about resilience, and the one that I found to be most helpful was one by Kaufman just a couple months ago now in the Scientific American, where he began to look at the notion of post-traumatic growth as opposed to post-traumatic trauma. And what he wrote was, trauma shakes us up, our world, and shakes up our world and forces us to take another look at our cherished goals and dreams. We tend to rely on a particular set of beliefs and assumptions about the benevolence and controllability of the world. And traumatic events typically shatter that worldview as we become shaken from our ordinary perceptions and are left to build ourselves and our worlds. So if you look at that definition about how trauma is related to resilience, there's probably a word or phrase that works for you that really begins to say, that speaks to my experience. So what I invite you to do is go to the chat, and then what is a word or phrase or something that really stands out for you? And I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to say, thank you. A few more. What word or phrase really pops out for you? Okay. And we'll give it another second or so. Huh. Ah, nice. Good. Yes. Yes. Okay. Okay, so those of you who have participated, thank you so much. You can see the range of things to which people are responding. And that gives us a sort of picture about what's cherished, but that shattering of the worldview, the rebuilding ourselves, shaken, taking another look at cherished. We can't see everything that people are sharing. Okay, I'm sorry about that. It should be in the all panelists and attendees. So when you go to the chat, you have to make sure it says all panelists and attendees in order for everyone to see it. But what we're beginning to learn from what you were saying is that if we were all sitting together, that would give us an opportunity to hear the different voices of what it is we're responding to. And what I invite you to do right now is just think about what it is that you chose, because that might have something to say about how you're managing this moment. But now, if we go to the next slide, let's learn something about what we are seeing about trauma. There are lots of different perspectives on what's going on right now. And one of those perspectives is that we are experiencing a collective trauma. If we think of trauma as simply defined as some experience that is disruptive to the norms to which we are accustomed, and there are all kinds of ways that that can be thought of, then collectively, 100% of us are experiencing that kind of disruption right now. But even before the pandemic, what we know is that 70% of adults in the general population in the United States have experienced something that is disproportionate to their regular experience. We can think about fires, hurricanes, witnessing violent crime, being a victim of some kind of assault. Those are all those kinds of traumas. But in addition to that, what we know is that despite those traumas, people tend to be relatively resilient. And in 20% of cases, then people go on to have what is called post-traumatic stress disorder, as opposed to this post-traumatic growth that we'll be talking about a little bit later. Right now, we can imagine that this number for health workers, and this was before the pandemic, 90% experience trauma. And then what we also know, which is kind of germane for us right now, is that at our southern border, that refugees and asylum seekers, 100% of them are known to experience trauma. So let's go on and let's see how this takes us a little further into the conversation. So Cynthia, next slide, please. So there are different ways to think about trauma. And what we want to talk about is this notion of intersectional trauma. And what does that mean? Is that trauma can be thought of as a very personal experience. When I was younger, I fell out of a class 5 rapid and went over what was essentially a waterfall. And if not for the wonderful work of the guides, I would not be having this conversation with you right now. That was a personal trauma. And obviously the energy that sort of activates in me means that this is very much still alive as an experience. But what we can also talk about is the notion of vicarious trauma, which means that we witness someone else going through a trauma. The person across the street whose house burned down when we were a child, the healthcare worker that we have as a close friend that describes what's going on, the person who lives in a situation of violence and deprivation, who constantly has that as a part of their experience. We don't have the direct experience, but vicariously, we know of their trauma. This pandemic, however, expresses a collective trauma. And then prior to this, people who lived in New York City, for example, and in Washington, D.C., at 9/11, that was a collective trauma. It was a trauma for the United States, yes. But for people who live closest to those kinds of traumas, there's a collective aspect of that. And in terms of pandemics and then epidemics, what happened in this country and the world during the AIDS crisis would be examples of collective trauma. But then in addition to that, there's historical trauma, the legacy of enslavement, the Holocaust, people who have experienced war and famine and natural disasters carry with them the legacies of that. And so if we go to the next slide, we then begin to see that you got traumatized by switching formats here. And so what the word is, you at this moment may be experiencing personal, vicarious, historical, and collective trauma. And so what I would like you to do, and we're going to do this again in the chat, is that only if you're comfortable doing this, because this is a public thing with your name on it, is that which of these are you experiencing right now? And again, I'm not going to ask you to do anything that I wouldn't do. But I have noticed in the pandemic that I'm experiencing a blend of historical, because of the issues of enslavement and how those are somehow more active and alive for me. And then also there's the aspect of the collective that are real for me right now. And now that doesn't mean that those are the only ones, but those are the two that are really very present for me right now. Okay, we're beginning to see, okay? Vicarious and collective, all but the personal, thank you. 2 or 3 more voices at least. And 1 more. Okay. Sorry about your loss there. Thank you. And so for those of you who have participated, what you can see and what you can see among those of who are sharing this experience with you is that all of us are experiencing multiple levels. Indeed, there's no person here who said that I'm not experiencing just one. I'm experiencing multiple aspects of this. And indeed, if we scratch the surface of all of us, chances are some aspect of this intersectional trauma is in this moment, which makes dealing with the pandemic even more of a challenge. Now let's go on to the next slide, please. So what we're going to look at here is that intersectional trauma has this real impact on us. The first part is that we know that intersectional trauma leads to an inability to manage uncertainty. Most of us can go through the day sort of not knowing this or that or whatever, but there's an uncertainty that is on top of everything right now, because we do not know when we're even going to be fully out of this position of being sheltered in place, let alone what it means for us to return to something that resembles patterns of behavior that we knew before the beginning of March. Increasingly unfiltered thoughts and behaviors. I don't know about you, but by living in this situation of relative isolation, and that means I live with 4 other people, but even in that circumstance, what happens is that I find myself feeling the confinement of like these little windows that we're in virtually, but also the confinement of not being able to have the kind of routine contact with other people. And all of that leads to sort of these unfiltered thoughts and behaviors in ways that we would prefer not to admit that we're experiencing. In addition to that, we have unhealthier psychological defenses. A lot of us walk around being able to sort of like push things out of our consciousness, walk through with patience, even show altruism. But in this kind of situation, we might find us snapping a little bit more quickly. We might find ourselves sort of like really just not responding the way that we want because of this intersectional trauma. And then the unwanted intrusive shadow. And what that means, the substance of the shadow, is that by being with ourselves, by being in the space, that there are aspects of ourselves that our lives don't allow us to sort of slow down and see. Well, in a pandemic, in a sheltered in place situation, under the same confinement all the time, that shadow catches up with us. And it shows up in dreams. It shows up in different ways that we prefer not to say. And you'll notice there's no request for chat here, because this is something that we need to know is going on, but it's also important to know that we're not alone in it. So let's take it from there. Okay. So I hope you're going to take us out of this no, not yet. Because what we're going to do is a really quick poll here, is that there's a model that begins to get us out of this. And in a sort of a developmental sequence. And if you're anything like me, you've experienced this. And so we're going to see if the poll is ready.
Yes.
Okay, good. Let's pull it up. So, which of these have you experienced? And so before you begin to respond, here we go. Rejection is the part of you that says, at some point, this is not really happening. This isn't real. They're exaggerating this. Okay, did you have that experience at any point in this? Regression is when I was a kid, I used to eat lots of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And so right now I'm eating lots of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And I don't mean that blithely. What I mean is that we find ourselves going to a part of ourselves where we had comfort, a sense of safety, a sense of security, and we find ourselves in that sort of regression. Repression, that means that I don't want to have this come up. I don't want to deal with what I'm seeing. It's different from rejection. Rejection is the active pushing it away. Repression is the beginning of things sort of bubbling up in you that you thought you'd put away for a long time. And then reflection is exactly what it sounds like. Reflection is that now I'm actively sort of thinking about this. So now it's your opportunity. Which of these have you experienced? And I don't get to do it because when there's a poll, they don't let me do it. Okay, so, and these are anonymous, of course. So, and you can do multiple answers if that's also the case. Okay, and we'll give the other 10 of you another 30 seconds to decide if you want to participate. Again, this is anonymous, and all it's going to do is just give us a sense of what's going on with us. Okay, and we're going to end, no, last 3 people if you want to. Multiple options not working. My bad. Okay, so choose the one that is most dominant for you. Okay, so let's end it there. Good. So what we're noticing is that a lot of us are beginning to move in the direction of reflection, but that doesn't mean that we don't have these others. Like you, and I hoped, that we'd got the multiple responses, but these really give us a picture, is that we want to move away from the sort of rejection or the denial. And the regression is actually a pretty normal and adaptive response. But the repression is a scary one, because that's when we begin to find parts of ourselves that we prefer not to see sometimes. And then those things begin to show up. But this is also a wonderful opportunity for reflection. And by that, what I mean is that if we can use this in a more proactive and healthy way, then reflection is an option. Okay, so let's stop the sharing of the poll. Okay, and we can pull that down. Good. And then let's go on to the next slide, please. And those of you in the chat, thank you for what you're providing. And so I really hate it when my slides get messed up. Okay, that's my perfectionism. I will get over myself. So what we have here is that you will see that these elements are not like a nice linear progression. What you have is that these are nested elements. By that, I mean that we're in the middle of this, but there's a part of us that still wants to reject this experience. There's a part of us that finds this repression sort of like happening and things bubbling up. We find that we are regressing and we hope to get to the point of reflection. So one of you put that you have all four of these, and this is actually true for all of us, is that on some level, all of these are going to be present because the nature of trauma, the nature of this experience is that all of these things superimpose on us at the same time. So let's take it to the next slide. Now let's begin to work on the resilience. So all of that, if you're anything like me, it says, okay, I knew all of that. You gave it language. Thank you so much. So what are we going to do about it? And that's where resilience comes in. The American Psychological Association talks about resilience being defined as the ability to adapt well and bounce back after facing adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant stress. And a pandemic is a significant stressor for us all. Let's go on to the next slide. And so let's begin to figure out what we're going to do with this, because George Bonanno wrote that this is our ability to bounce back isn't as uncommon. As a matter of fact, what you will see here is the ability of people who have experienced a highly life-threatening traumatic event to maintain relatively stable, healthy levels of psychological and physical functioning is actually pretty common. So if you remember our earlier slide, that 70% of people as adults are going to go through some trauma that's sort of inherent in the human condition practically. But only 20%, then, not to denigrate or to reduce the importance of that, go on to what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. So for the rest of us, except in those situations, this kind of resilience is actually pretty common. But it's not the same as a simple absence of psychopathology. In other words, this ability to bounce back, especially if we're having some kind of mental health issues, means that what we can sometimes do is figure out from a variety of routes a way to heal. That really means that we are facing the adversity because it forces our adaptation. It forces us to have direct confrontation, and it forces us to deal with the disruption. So let's go on to see where we go with this. Now, what you will see there is this beautiful little cup. And he says, that's a nice piece of gold in it. But in Japanese culture, there's Kensugi, which some of you may know about. It's a wonderful practice where when a piece of pottery is broken, then what is done is the pieces are gathered together, and then a blend of lacquer and gold and silver are used to put it back together. And then what you have is something that is actually quite beautiful, but the heritage of its brokenness is still there. And so what we're now inviting you to think about is then, how do we work from the sort of brokenness that trauma brings us to find that adaptation? So the next slide, please. So as I was alluding to, is then post-traumatic growth. And that means our capacity to grow with or to find meaning in and creativity in these adversities. And if you look at this slide closely, it is the proverbial idea of that plant that is so strong and so resilient that where there was supposed to be dirt, there's concrete, but yet it breaks through. And what the invitation for all of us right now is to begin to break through this concrete, break through the adversity of this pandemic, to find a different direction, a different focus. So let's begin to talk about that. Next slide, thank you. So growth from adversity. Now, I want you to think about that. It was difficult to read the full text in the Kensugi slide because of the dark background in one part. Yes, I know. The conversion of the slides to Zoom meant all of the effort that I put into to make sure that they have both the visual appeal and also the language didn't work. So my apologies for that. But I will try to read those so that you can do that. And we will also make the slides available to everybody that participates in this webinar. You can feel assured of that. So what we know in terms of growth from adversity is that when we have growth from adversity, what we're talking about is greater appreciation of life, greater appreciation and strengthening of close relationships, increased compassion and altruism, identification of new possibilities or purpose in life, greater awareness and utilization of personal strengths, enhanced spiritual development, growth in creativity or artistry. So what I would want you to do right now is just look at that list. And even if it's not happening now, which one of those areas of growth, just one, is one that you would like to begin to cultivate, one that you would like to have come out of the concrete. And we were going to do it as a poll, but let's just do it in the chat. And this is sort of like a sort of a commitment to each of these for, and like I said, anything that I do, ask you to do, I'm going to do myself. And so let's begin to put those in. And just choose one for right now. One or two more. Thank you. Yes, and you can do adaptations off of these. You don't have to do this list. This list is just a way to give us a focus. Wonderful. Thank you. So what I would ask you to do is, in addition to writing down on the chat, is that I want all of us to begin to make this commitment to ourselves. So what I'm going to do, and just like you just did, is that, okay, I said it's about relationships. And so part of what we know is that we live by these things better when we write them down. And so writing it down in the chat is one thing, but to find a pen, a piece of paper, and then to just write it down means that we're making that commitment cognitively at the deepest level to begin to move into that. So I'm going to write it down for myself right now. Okay. All right. So do the same thing for yourself. So now let's begin to deepen our work. So what do we know about post-traumatic growth? This, you know, it's nice that the idea that we can grow from trauma, it's nice, but it's not preferred. What we now know is from the research is that most people would prefer to have not had the trauma, regardless of the benefit that they got from the trauma. So I think anyone here who's experienced trauma would agree with that I would prefer not to have that as my experience. Okay, that's the first part. Now, this is the part that's really difficult, is that even those of us who have grown from some traumatic experience, the other part is that growth from positive events is sustained longer. So just because you had a trauma and just because you grew from the trauma, positive affirming events actually has a longer half-life, if you will, than those experiences that come from trauma. Trauma tends to play in our heads for our entire lives, but the growth from it does not necessarily have the same kind of lasting impact as loving, caring relationships and a holding experience. Resilience and adaptation isn't something that we just do easily. Resilience and adaptation really means that we have to transform the adversity. It means a cognitive shift to recognize that this adverse experience is something that was a teacher to me. And for some of us, especially in extremely painful circumstances, that transformation of thinking takes years and years of work. And then this is the one that's really difficult about trauma and what makes post-traumatic growth a challenging concept. And the authors around this recognize it, is that once we have a trauma, once it is triggered, then it's subject to morphing. And by that, what it means is that that which was the original source of trauma will take a different form and it will repeat itself. And it's not the same thing, but it's like it, and it's close enough. So, for example, if there was somebody that you were afraid of, and then later on there's somebody that's like a boss or a coworker that reminds you of that person, they're not that person, but it activates the same kind of thing. And I think some of you, if you really allow that repression to open up a little bit, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, those are the caveats, those are the concerns, but let's go on from there. So there are some things that we really need to think about in terms of this, in terms of what does it mean to have a resilience orientation. And so what we're going to do is that, Cynthia, do you have the breakout room function on that side? Or in a webinar, do we have that?
Webinar does not include breakout.
That is really deeply unfortunate because we have just the right amount of people, but nonetheless, let's do it this way. So we'll have to do it as a sort of a private process. I want you to do this, is that, and I'm going to give it to you in a 3-step process, is that you have immediate resources and you have immediate stressors. Okay, so let me model it for you. So the immediate resource that I have is that I'm relatively good about meditation. I'm relatively good about staying in touch with friends. I'm relatively good about doing something every day in terms of at least moving my body, okay? But I have the stress sources. I've got 2 kids that I'm helping to homeschool. I am doing events like this where I have to do, you know, the preparation of it. I have a number of family members and friends who are going through all kinds of inordinate stress, and I'm really beginning to feel that. And then there are a couple organizations that I'm a part of that are just on the edge of surviving right now. So those are stressors that I'm feeling. But then what are the strengths that I have to sort of cope with it? How do I cultivate that positive attitude? Well, okay, then I need to rest, because if I don't rest, then that really creates a difficulty or challenge for me. And then I also know if I spend time with my family, you know, and we have that meal together and we're actually able to enjoy each other's company, that helps me cope better. And as I alluded to, the meditation and the walk, they help me do that. Now, select potential routes to resolution. All right, given the stressors that I'm under, you know, I do meditate, but I haven't been doing it the way I was. So maybe I need to work on that. And then how do I engage in healthier practices that promote wholeness and healing? So now that's the part where I have to begin to commit to move in that direction. So if we have the next slide, please. So we're going to put our ear to this. What that means is a very simple 3-step process to think about how we can be resilient. Is number 1, can we engage our strengths? Number 2, how do we assess our progress? And number 3, how do we renew? So what we're going to do right now, everybody here, is that I want you to begin to think about what is a strength that you have that maybe you're not cultivating. So that involves really beginning to think about, what do I have as a capacity to cope? It doesn't matter if you're using it right now, but you have that capacity. And some of you are saying, well, I don't know what I have. And say, well, just allow yourself to think, maybe if I just shifted my attitude a little bit. And I would give you that one because we know from the way that we're working with these issues that that alone makes a tremendous shift, is to begin to look at things from a more positive perspective. But for each of you to identify a strength that you have. And if you're comfortable, write down the strength in the chat. You don't have to, of course. But if you have a strength that you want to cultivate or that you already have, then let's begin to put those down. Okay, 2 or 3 more voices if you're comfortable. This is not something that you have to do. There we go. There we go. Thank you. Yes, optimism, empathy, getting back on schedule, physical activity, meditation and prayer, faith, Christian music, compassion and connection, creativity, confidence, wellness, creativity. Okay, thank you. Now, those are strengths that you already know that you have, and we all know that we have that. Taking some time out from the stressors, connection and getting on a good schedule. So not only are you, detail oriented, getting into those details. Thank you for offering that one. Art and poetry, I want to thank you for your participation. This really is really inviting me to think about some that I didn't even consider that I also have in my repertoire. Now, what you would need to do is assess your progress. Some of you have already talked about the detail and the scheduling. What is necessary for a process like this in terms of resilience is to not only identify the strengths, but also create a sort of commitment to yourself that this is something that you want to do. So what I would do is I would say, okay, then I want to begin to do daily meditation. Even for 5 minutes. Okay. So I do meditate while I'm walking, and that's sort of my cheat. I can say I'm doing a walk meditation, but I know that for me, a sitting meditation is my strength. And when I do that, it makes a huge difference in terms of my resilience. And so now assessing your progress is determine what is the gap between where you are in terms of that strength and your current practice. And so again, you don't have to put these in the chat, but you can begin to, because that's the beginning of your commitment. This is sort of a public declaration about the nature of your resilience. Okay, 1 or 2 more, please, if you want. Again, it's only if you want to, because this is a public thing. Okay, wonderful. And maybe 1 more. Thank you. There we go. Thank you so much, everyone. Okay. Now, the third part. I really like the way the physical activity, the meditation, to just start this, make gratitude daily practice, learning something, listening to music, gratitude in the morning, connections with my children and my husband without the distractions, and finding time to engage in music. Wonderful. And so one of you wrote on the previous one about poetry, and I used to allow myself to do that, and now you're inviting me to think about, that's something that I would want to engage. And now you would put a time frame on that. So I want to begin to, in the next day, begin this meditation. And then this renews my resilience. It begins to add to my reservoir. And then if it doesn't work, then I just repeat this process over and over and over again until I really get it down. So we have ears to hear, so let's listen to ourselves and let's begin to live into this resilience. Now let's go on to the next slide. So what we know is that if you don't have a practice, if you don't have something that really works for you, the nature of trauma is that it leads to rumination. And what we mean by rumination is, that's that repetitive thought. It's not just that random thought, but it's like the intrusive thought. What if you could turn that around? What if you could turn negative, destructive rumination into deliberate rumination, so that you use that to set the intention? So I want to set the intention of meditating for at least 5 minutes a day. I was going to say tomorrow, but what about today? And what positive changes in relationships then begins to happen? What perceptions of new possibilities that begin to emerge? So this is what begins to happen. It's just like this plant that begins to break through, then it begins to radiate out to the sun and it has growth. So it is with each of us, is that as we begin to break through this adversity, then we have the capacity to begin to change our relationships and begin to see new possibilities. Another practice that we know works is expressive writing. And what we mean by expressive writing is that if you release what's going on in terms of the adversity onto the written page, using a journal like this or any other form, writing that poetry, doing that piece of art, then it allows it to move out of your body in a way that it becomes something that you can look at, something that you can work with, and allows for reflection. Excuse me. And now, excuse me. There we go. And now, sorry, I need some resilience here. And now, what are your, those are your answers. Okay, hold on a second. So now the question is, how do you begin to put that into a practice? So what you're each to do is what is called a 10-word memoir. And a 10-word memoir is a sort of a 10-word intention about what it is that you're going to do. So mine has what I worked with before, greater appreciation of relationships through beginning to do meditation. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so try to find what you worked on before. Remember that was the definition and you had some keywords in that. So to work with that, and then come up with this sort of 10 words that sort of allows you to have right in front of you, almost like a mantra, what it is you're going to do. So greater appreciation of relationships through beginning to do, if I had daily meditation, then I have my 10 words. Find your 10 words. Find 10 words that are going to remind you on a daily basis what it is that you're going to do in terms of your own post-traumatic growth. And it doesn't have to be 10 words. It can just be one line that reminds you of what that is. Take a moment to do it now. And you don't have to put this in the chat, but if you do, that's great. Thank you. Constant appreciation of life and relationships through meditation and gratitude. That's beautiful. And maybe one more so that we can see this. Greater compassion for self through daily yoga and physical exercise. 5 minutes will change everything. Welcome each day as a new gift and opportunity. You're getting the idea. That is absolutely outstanding. So let's go to the last piece here. Okay, so let's return to Viktor Frankl here. Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. So a number of you are in the chat right now, and a number of others of you privately are doing your thing. What you're doing right now is you're identifying your path towards resilience, your post-traumatic growth, your way of working into this moment and doing, as Viktor Frankl talked about, living through this pandemic and finding your resilience. So let's continue to work on those. Let's continue to find those statements. And then let's use the last few minutes here for any questions that you may have. I want to thank you for your participation. This has been glorious. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Green, and thank you for that time of reflection. As I always sit and hear you, it kind of just brings peace to my spirit, so I appreciate that. We are going to ask if anybody has any questions. You can type them in the chat, or you can hit the question and answer button there, and you can type it there as well. Dr. Green, I'll start with something that someone wrote that maybe might be a little bit helpful for others also. And I'll read the bottom portion of this. It says, I want to journal more now, both for therapy and for a historical piece for me and my kids. But I have a hard time putting things in a journal as a result of this experience. And this was a previous experience. Any suggestions on how to get past this?
There are many ways to record this moment. Those of us who use journals, that's totally fine. But there are other ways to record this moment. One of the things that my grandmother did with a trauma when I was young, I'm old enough to have been a baby when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And what we did is we took clippings from the newspaper and we chronicled it, and we put all of those in a scrapbook. There's another way that can be done right now in terms of just taking our phone, hitting that button, and doing a recording. And that way, the act of writing it isn't necessary, but we are recording that moment. Another thing that people are doing now is taking photographs of things that they're doing to sort of speak to it. I took a picture of myself with my mask on when I was outside, with a gate that was closed, so that I would have a picture of this moment in addition to writing that I'm doing. So if we think about recording as simply writing in a journal, for some of us, that's not who we are. But the poetry that we write, the photographs we take, the recipes that we use, the videos that we make, the blog that we write, all of these are different ways to express it.
And Dr. Green, I guess that since it's on a telephone, a lot of other privacy is there. So that gives you sometimes the security of this is from me and no one else has access to it.
Right.
Okay, we have another question that's come up also, but please finish your thought, Dr. Green.
No, there's one about the larger suffering that I'm seeing that someone has written about. And I just wrote an article about that because one of the issues right now is that most of us have deep awareness that a lot of the structural inequalities and inequities are beginning to reveal themselves. And so there is this real circle of concern about the planet and what we are recognizing, that the planet appears to try to heal itself in this 2 months that it hasn't had to deal with human activity in the same sort of way. But we're also seeing the gross expression of the violence of humans towards each other. For example, the Ahmaud Arbery killing in Georgia. And so we're also seeing that people who have a disproportionate outcomes in terms of infection rates, as well as lethality related to this virus. And so any of us who work in this sector have concerns about those things, as we should. But there's also this, there are two different circles. This circle in terms of our immediate influence and the circle of concern. The circle of concern can be the place to which we put our empathy and compassion, but our effectiveness is in that circle of influence. And so if we can do the work within our circles of influence, then we don't get burnt out as much. We don't get as bombarded by all the different things that are showing up, because the virus is expressing itself not only in terms of its potential lethality to the body, but to the body of us as a collective in terms of the different ways that it's morphing and showing its face. Okay, Lynn, is there another question that we have?
Not as a, yeah, I think you answered that one. And we'll ask, there's 3 minutes left, and then we will go into our after hours. But I'll ask at this time if anybody has any other questions and they'd like to have Dr. Green respond, please feel free to type it into the chat window, please.
Well, while we're waiting, one of the things that I could say is that what I worked on earlier this morning is that one of the things that people are grappling with is how much aggression has been unlocked by this virus as well. There are all kinds of great acts of altruism, selflessness, but there's also another piece that is showing up, which is the uglier or shadow parts of who we are. And so we collectively have a responsibility in terms of making sure that we are not the ones that perpetuate those kinds of pieces of ourselves. It means really discovering within ourselves this resilience that I've been speaking about so passionately, so that when we are in that place and when we're in that space, that we have much more reserve within ourselves to be able to cope with whatever comes our way.
Very, very nice, Dr. Reed. Thank you for sharing that. And then we'll go ahead and ask for another time in our final minute if anyone has any burning question that they'd like to share with Dr. Green. And as all of you, I'll take this time also to remind you this will be recorded so that you have a chance to go back and take a look at it. It'll also come along with the slides so that you'll have a chance to review those and also make sure that you have the opportunity to take some notes. There's this advisement focused on doing all that we can within our circle is what is getting many of my colleagues and myself manage. We work with survivors of conflict-related trauma who were already dealing with the effects of extreme adverse experiences in the past. So avoiding getting overwhelmed by the big picture is a real challenge.
Absolutely. That is one of the biggest issues, is that those people who are working with the people who are traumatized are getting the vicarious trauma. And this really requires a cycling out on a regular basis, because then what happens is the absence of resilience then leads to the collapse of those systems. So those systems have to have incredible discipline in terms of making sure that there are enough resources to meet the moment, but also at the same time making sure that people have enough of a respite to be able to re-enter the fray. And what we are learning about that is that in those places where they're able to continue to be present, they are doing those practices. And that's going to take a lot of work.
Dr. Green, I have a couple of questions, but I do want to make sure we're respectful of people's time. So we will conclude the regular webinar right now. And we thank everybody for attendance. And we ask that you also continue this as we will go into June with this series. So make sure you either log on to the Fieldstone Network and or to the Nonprofit Institute and to follow our information. And Dr. Green, somebody has asked, can they follow you on Instagram?
You can follow me on LinkedIn. And I don't do Facebook or Instagram anymore. I can't do that stuff. And then a quick shout out that some of you, and the shout out is that we do have a resilience-based coaching program that is free to the public for anybody who wants to do the deeper work on this. We offer 3 sessions free through the Nonprofit Institute. So you can sign up for that, and Cynthia will make sure that we get you assigned to a coach.
Okay, well, we thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you again through this series and through some of the other offerings that we have. And Dr. Green, so we will stay on for our after hours. After hours officially begins now. And you've kind of answered this with talking about the resilience-based coaching. But do you have any tips on how nonprofits can cope and find resilience in this challenging time, nonprofits specifically?
Yes, the Harvard Business Review put out a recent article, and we actually did this work ourselves as a Nonprofit Institute, is that there are ways that nonprofit teams really need to work together. And there are 3 things that you need to work on. Number 1 is to figure out where you're having gaps in sort of like focus and discipline. As hard as it may sound, and it's difficult because you're out there serving the world, is that where is the place in terms of your disciplined focus? So everyone needs to develop disciplined focus. So that's one of the things you have to do. The second thing that teams have to do in nonprofit institutes is that the concern is so great. So where's the focus? Where is the focus? And what do you want to focus on? Your nonprofit, that's your focus. To the degree you can sort of stay in that space and place while recognizing that there are broad band of other efforts, then find those partners and connections, but where do you focus? And then the third part is what we just worked on today, is the personal resilience, is that every person on the team needs to find his, her, their way of finding their resilience, because otherwise everybody gets burnt out. And so focus in terms of actually discipline, focus in terms of the work, and then focus in terms of your own personal resilience. All of those have to happen at the same time.
Very nice. We'll see if, are there any other questions that we can ask or subjects that you would like us to make sure that we cover?
The only other thing that I can think of in terms of the resilience piece is that I didn't talk about the shadow side, and I don't like to talk about it too much, but I'll speak to it just a little bit, is that when we don't find the post-traumatic growth, when we don't find the resilience, then there are health consequences from this. So trauma has a sort of a long-term physiological output in terms of hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, obesity. Those kinds of things all show up because of that. It also makes one more vulnerable to addiction, high-risk behaviors, and things of that sort. And then also it is erosive on mental health. And so when we don't find the resilience, then it shows up in other kinds of ways and literally becomes embodied. So I didn't want to hit that really hard, but that is the other side of this. And so if we, those of you that are still on, is that that's the consequence if we don't begin to move in these resilient directions.